So good morning again. I'm going to start off by sharing a video. It's an interview with Greg Braden that was done through London Reel, and it was about a 50-minute video, and this is an excerpt of it. And although this is a longer video than I usually share in a service, I think it is well worth it. So I start us off with Greg Braden.
I don't hear the media talking about this. I don't hear many people talking about this at all. We're talking about the virus, the logistics, the physical impact, mitigation, vaccines, medicines, all of that. What I don't see anyone talking about is what's happening to us emotionally. There's a lot of anger. There's resentment, there's confusion, there is frustration, there is depression. And what I want to say to our viewing audience right now is that our entire planet, for the very first time, I don't think we've ever had this in recorded human history. For the first time, we are simultaneously going through a process of grief. We are all in grief, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or subconsciously, and whether we acknowledge it or not. We are all in grief. And the question is, what are we grieving? And the answer to that surprises a lot of people. We are grieving the loss of a way of life. The way that we were living our lives 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, we've lost that. It's been taken from us. We're social beings, and we are no longer able to gather together the way that we have in the past. Conferences, social gatherings, meals in restaurants, athletic events, concerts, all of the movies, all of those kinds of things. And that loss to us is like any other loss. And in the process of grief, and I can't do a better job than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did, talking about the grief cycle. So I'm going to hold this up. The grief cycle often is, we hear about in terms of death. When someone dies, the 5 stages of accepting that death. The death is a form of loss. We are experiencing another kind of loss, but the 5 stages still apply. So very quickly, those 5 stages, the first one is denial, the second one is anger, the third is depression, the fourth is bargaining, and the fifth is acceptance. The characteristics of denial is fear. So many people are in fear, shock, confusion, avoidance. The characteristics of the anger, anxiety, and we're having a lot of people saying they're dealing with anxiety issues, problems sleeping, frustration, they're irritable, depression, feeling overwhelmed, helpless, wanting to just run away. We are, as a planet, we're dealing with this, and I think it's important to acknowledge this. Acknowledging these stages of grief, it gives us a structure within which to view what's happening to us right now. So it's not just like coming at us from all over for no apparent reason. There is a reason. We're in grief because we've lost a way of life. When we go through those stages, we can go through these stages relatively quickly if we acknowledge and embrace them, or we can drag them out by refusing to acknowledge what's happening. So the denial, the anger, the depression is pretty much, I think, where most people, somewhere in there right now. We're trying to get to the bargaining and the acceptance. Some people are in the bargaining stage right now. We're looking for meaning. We're reaching out to others. The acceptance is where we begin looking beyond what's happening now. We accept it, we embrace it, and we say, okay, what's next? Where do we go? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is happening to us, number one. How can we deal with the problem unless we're honest with ourselves about the problem? So honestly, acknowledging that this is what's happening, we're going through these stages. And then there is a thinking. There's something called normalcy bias in psychological terms. Normalcy bias is where we attempt to live life as normal as we always have in the presence of circumstances that are anything but normal. It's a coping mechanism. It's our way of dealing. It's a form of denial. I'm experiencing this now with people I work with. As you know, I travel the world. I do live events, and I have producers who are asking me to make commitments for events in the near future as if nothing has happened, believing that when the isolation is over, everything goes back to normal. We can't go back to the world that we knew 3 or 4 weeks ago because that world no longer exists. We're entering into a new normal. And the question is, what does that new normal look like? The answer is, We don't know because we're determining it right now. The choices we make right now are determining the world that is emerging. So how we deal with those 5 stages. Grief, counseling is important. We all deal with grief in different ways. The unresolved grief is what's hurting a lot of people. A lot of people have a mental idea, a mental picture of the world that we had a month ago, and they're hanging on to that picture, and that is the frustration. That is the struggle. That's the suffering, because that world is not present right now. If we can let go of our idea of what should be in the past, the world that we've had that served us all, be present with what it is that we're dealing with now, and do what we need to get through this in a healthy way, that will inform the future. I believe we're going to be better people. I believe we're going to have a better world because of what we've just gone through, because it has exposed the cracks in the foundation of society, the cracks in the foundation of our systems that we rely upon. What's sustainable, what's not, what works, what doesn't work. So that's the reason for my optimism. My realism comes from knowing where we are right now, and that we've got to acknowledge and embrace this in a healthy way.
So in this video, Greg Braden talks about the collective experience of grief that humankind is experiencing in present time. And although degrees of loss varies from person to person and varies among groups of people, be it age, race, socioeconomic status, the focus of Greg Braden's video is about grieving the way of life. Yesterday, as my son got engaged, after his proposal, Matt was doing the photos, and it was so different not to be able to hug them. Both of them work with COVID patients, so social distancing is appropriate at this point, or to be able to go out to dinner with them and to do other things. And yes, I am grateful, but boy, did my heart ache to hug them both so dearly. And so as we all look at the loss, experience this loss of a way of life, and as we live through this pandemic, we all face grief very differently. Some may be very keenly aware of their grief and are actively doing inner work and doing the healing work, while many avoid at all costs any feelings that have to do with grief, believing that stoicism and being as tough as nails is the way to go. And some deny the existence of grief altogether, while many minimize their grief. And so let me know if any of these sound familiar to you. How can I feel sad or angry about not being able to go and visit or hug my son or my parents, my grandchildren, my dear friends, when so many have lost loved ones to COVID-19? How can I feel sadness or be angry about my wedding being postponed indefinitely? So many have lost their jobs and have no income. How can I feel sad or angry about losing my job when so many are worse off than me? Are there any other minimizers out there? The minimization of loss is something I am very familiar with. At the age of 17, I remember believing I had no right to be sad or angry or frightened at the fact that I had to undergo invasive and painful back surgery. After all, my cousin Colin, who was living with a life-threatening illness, had it much worse than I did. And I could really trace back in my adolescent years, all the way up into young adulthood, how many losses, and some of them very significant, that I minimized because others had it worse than me. And my friends, when we avoid, deny, stuff, minimize, plow our way aggressively, blame, attack others, all ways of dysfunctionally healing with our grief, not only do we suffer, but those around us, our collective suffers. When we do not face our grief, heal our grief, we prolong and even intensify our suffering. It becomes a catalyst for physical ailments, emotional disturbance, and unrest. Not really fully grieving the many surgeries and being homeschooled for 2 years of my high school years and being assaulted led to major digestive issues. Still to today, some arise. And I know when digestion issues arise, I ask myself, what is it that I am not willing to digest? What grief is surfacing for me? And each one of you must distinguish that for yourself. What are the signals of our body, our emotions, that are letting us know that we are not face to face with what is most alive within us? And also, when we do not allow ourselves to fully mourn or grieve, we rob ourselves of intimacy and authenticity. Intimacy with ourselves, with others, and for me, very profoundly, the most intimate relationship I can have with the divine. You know, unless the grieving process has been modeled for us, or we have developed a very rich inner spiritual practice, we usually then take on grief the way it has been modeled for us, the way the patterns that have been passed down through our families, societies, our culture, so on and so on. And many times they are dysfunctional patterns. The master teacher, Jesus, discusses the inner process of grief in the second of 8 of the Beatitudes that I introduced last week that are contained in the Sermon of the Mount. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, found in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. And in Discover the Power Within You, Eric Butterworth states that the second beatitude, like all the other beatitudes and pretty much all of Jesus's teachings, have been misinterpreted, be it translation issues. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, most of the Bible's written in Greek, due it to the weaponizing of spiritual doctrine, so on and so on. And Eric Butterworth states that for many, through religious doctrine, have interpreted the second beatitude to be this: you are richly blessed to have the tragedy and sorrow now, because your reward will come in a future heaven. So Jesus always spoke of the kingdom of heaven is here and now, and the kingdom of heaven is within. So let us take a clearer, a deeper look at what this beatitude, what the teaching of Jesus was trying to inform us of. Through the inner process of mourning, we allow ourselves to be comforted by the mystical presence of divine grace and love. And in doing so, we allow our hearts to open to a greater capacity to love. Now, this is easier said than done. I would like to share a powerful quote from Ken Wilber, author of Grace and Grit. And this book is about his experience of grief as he walked through 5 or 6 years of his wife's cancer treatments, and then ultimately as he walked with her as she transitioned. And Ken states, real love hurts. Real love will make you totally open and vulnerable. And real love will take you far beyond yourself. And therefore, real love will devastate you. I keep thinking, if real love does not shatter you, you do not know love. Pretty powerful and passionate words from Ken Wilber. He speaks about vulnerability, open vulnerability as the key inner quality needed in order to be transformed by love. And Cynthia Bergault, the scholar of the wisdom teachings of Jesus, says that within the beatitude, the second beatitude, the inner qualities that Jesus is asking us to call forth, the kingdom of God is within, the inner transformation is within, and the inner qualities he is speaking of are the qualities of vulnerability and flow. And Bergault teaches that mourning is indeed a brutal form of emptiness. But in this emptiness, if we can remain open, we will discover that a mysterious something does reach back to comfort us, the tendrils of our grief trailing out into the unknown becomes intertwined in a greater love. Love that holds all things together. To mourn is to touch directly the substance of the divine. And only this can come when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. So within the second beatitude, Jesus speaks of our ability to be vulnerable, to be open, to be transformed through the process of grief. And it is also important, in order for us to allow grief to heal us, we also must learn to flow. Now, we speak of flow as one of the aspects of the power of order, to flow with the winds of life, to flow freely as to what is before us, knowing that we live in this impermanent world and that change is inevitable. But here, Cynthia is talking about flow in the form of tears and lamenting. Through our tears and through the practice of lamenting, we allow the flow of mourning to be expressed and to be released. We've heard so many different things, just like how we have learned different patterns about grieving. Crying is another societal and familiar pattern. You know, tears represent people who are weak, or never let them see you sweat, so on and so on. But as we look at flow through tears as necessary, as a necessary component to healing, think of an ice cube, right? If you put it on water, put it in a glass, it will automatically sink to the bottom. And only when it melts, it can flow freely. Science has shown that through tears, through our crying, that we release stress, tension, and that hormones are released that help in the healing process. And science has also shown that tears is also a powerful and profound part of connection, of social bonding, of building deeper relationships with one another. If we look at both the Hebrew scriptures, which is also called the Old Testament, and the Christian scriptures, which is the New Testament, there are over 100 passages designated to tears, mourning, and grief. Within the Hebrew scriptures alone, the book of Job contains 35 chapters dedicated to Job's lamenting his deep loss, his deep sorrow, and his grief. We see him swear, question God, on his knees, deny, so on and so on. And it is said that Jesus, the master teacher, is one of the profound teachers of living with an open heart. They say that Buddha is a great teacher, yes, of compassion, but is of mindfulness, whereas the master teacher, Jesus, really speaks what it's like to live compassionately and with an open heart. And we could also see chronicled within the New Testament how many times Jesus was weeping, even right before he, in the allegory of raising Lazarus from the dead, his first thing he does is he hugs the sister, the mother, and he weeps with them. He weeps and sobs before he bends down and does his healing work. You know, lamenting, crying together, weeping together as a spiritual practice through the ages has been falsely labeled as not believing in God, not having faith in God. Because if we would be just filled with that faith and knowing, missing the whole aspect of the healing that is there. And many people who gather today in churches and spiritual communities, even in New Thought communities, believe that all lessons and teachings and sermons should be upbeat and joyous. And they lose sight of the healing power of weeping together, whether it be through tears of joy or tears of sorrow. And it is why sometimes I craft Taze services, which are really heart-opening services. And I'm not saying that that's not the only service. We do remembrance services. But if we are to live authentically and vulnerably and with a whole heart, we must embrace lamentation and mourning together. So let's just take a deep breath in and just check in with yourself. What are you noticing? Are you noticing a pattern of how you deal with grief? Are you a minimizer, a denier? Do you explode, implode? Do you think it's a weakness? Do you think that spiritual teachings or community gatherings, whether it be on Mother's Day, Father's Day, all should be happy and upbeat. So I invite you into a deeper understanding of the second beatitude. Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And I'd like to end with a couple of translations. Neil Douglas Katz has done a lot of translating of the works of Jesus. He has studied the Aramaic language, and so he gives many, and so here are some that I share with you. Ripe are those who feel at loose ends, coming apart at the seams. They shall be knit back together within. Healed are those who weep for their frustrated desire. They shall see the face of fulfillment in a new form. And I share two of my own. Blessed are you who live from an open and wise heart, for in your weeping, you will be embraced by grace and transformed by the flow of divine love within. And I also try to, in studying the Beatitudes, create an I am, a personal affirmation, which leads me to the second one I penned. With courageous vulnerability, I embrace grief with an open and wise heart, for I am transformed by the alchemy of divine grace and love. Oh, blessed am I. So my friends, I invite you maybe during the sharing today, if you so choose to be vulnerable to share, how are you doing with your own grief? And then I also invite you this week into looking at the beatitude, the second beatitude. Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And perhaps may you be moved to write your own interpretation of it. Blessings of light and love to you all, and I look forward to connecting with you during fellowship.